Today on Lead Like Elon, I'm going to look at the concept of sunk costs. Sunk costs are anything that you've invested that you can't get back. So for example, if your intention is to drive west and you discover that you've been driving east, you have no choice but to turn around and go in the other direction. You don't say, but I've invested so much in coming this far. You change your mind. But it can get really complicated when you're involved in a large venture and discover that it's not going to do what you had in mind, or it's not going to make money, or it's not going to be sustainable. And yet the temptation is to not admit defeat. We've invested this much, let's keep going. Whenever you talk about sunk costs, the term Concord fallacy comes up. The Concord was a commercial airliner that could go supersonic, that was built in a consortium between the French government and the British government. It was originally conceived in 1956, and it didn't fly until 1976. So it took 20 years to build, far longer than anybody anticipated. And it was originally expected to cost 70 million pounds, British pounds, and wound up costing 1.3 billion British pounds. The development of the Concorde is often cited as a sunk cost fallacy because of the duration of the project. It was 20 years from conception to the first planes flying. And there were plenty of opportunities to see that this probably wasn't going to be a great project. It wasn't going to have great outcomes commercially. One problem with supersonic air travel is the sonic boom. So any flight, wherever it starts, there's going to be a sonic boom. And then wherever it is going to land, there's going to be another sonic boom as it goes through the sound barrier, first faster than sound, and then again, slower than sound. There's a boom at each end. So the flights that were available were all over the ocean, and basically just a transatlantic flight. That was the only flight where the time saving was justified, or could even come close to being justified. And so you wind up with a very limited set of routes the plane could fly. And also because of the technology of the day, the plane couldn't be too big. It had to have a certain wingspan for the weight and that kind of thing. So you wound up with a very narrow fuselage to reduce drag. And so you had this combination of a narrow fuselage, which meant very cramped and very low quantity of seats, and also a supersonic jet that uses a ton of fuel, like far more fuel than a regular airliner. So you wound up with tickets per seat that were, I think, 8 times as expensive as a regular flight. What these factors meant was that the Concorde was basically dead before arrival, and they should have seen that coming. But it was, again, this idea of, well, in for a penny, in for a pound. Whatever justification there was to embark on this program, people were like, well, we spent this much money. We should spend some more to finish it. We shouldn't let the money we've already spent go to waste. And that's the essence of the sunk cost fallacy. What I want to look at today, because this program is called Lead Like Elon, is some examples of where Elon Musk has doubled down on an existing investment, whether that was wise to do. When does he give up? When does he know when to hold them and know when to fold them? And what can we learn from that in our own ventures? When we talk about sunk costs, usually what we're talking about is an error that somebody made, doubling down on something that was doomed to fail. So how do we reconcile this with Elon Musk saying he'll never give up? These are his words. He'll never give up. I'd have to be dead or incapacitated.
That third failure in a row, did you think, I need to pack this in?
Never.
Why not?
I don't ever give up. I mean, I'd have to be dead or completely incapacitated.
8 weeks later, Musk bet the company on another flight.
We have liftoff.
Elon made this comment in reference to SpaceX. SpaceX is extremely successful now and makes flights to orbit look routine. But in the beginning, it was attempting something that had never been done before, which was a private organization, a company, putting a satellite into orbit. Prior to that, only nation states had done such a thing, 6 nation states. So it was a risky venture, and the first 3 attempts to put something into orbit that SpaceX undertook, they all blew up. All 3 failed. And so not only was he in a position where he had to keep doubling down, one rocket blows up, let's pay for another. Another rocket blows up, let's pay for another. Another rocket blows up, let's pay for another. It was actually, Elon was a very rich man when he started this venture. It could have wiped out not his ability to have, a roof over his head and food, but certainly his ability to embark on a similar venture in the future, because he wouldn't have the money and he wouldn't have the credibility. So this is interesting because Elon could have easily have given up the first time, the second time, the third time. How do we, if we're going to lead like Elon Musk, calibrate between tenacity and flexibility? So one important clue is that there is a difference between giving up on a goal and giving up on an approach. And there are a few examples from Elon Musk that illustrate this. There are examples of Elon giving up on things. He says he never gives up, but in fact he does. It really depends on what the end goal is meant to be. If the steps to the end goal turn out not to be as productive as he would have hoped, he's happy to backtrack and go a different way. So let's look at these examples. The first example is what he referred to as the alien Dreadnought. It was this idea that the journey of Tesla was, it began with the Roadster, and the Roadster was a Lotus coupe or Roadster that they modified and put an electric drivetrain in. Super expensive, super difficult. Almost had to redesign the entire car anyway. It was a real challenge to get this going, but fortunately they were charging a lot of money for it, and it got enough attention that it got investment. But that was a stepping stone. The next step was the Model S. This was the first vehicle that the company had built or had designed from scratch, right from the tires up. But it was still a relatively low volume car, as was the Model X to follow it, which is the SUV. It was only when they got to the Model 3 that they were starting to imagine that they could build cars in high volume, like Camry level volume, and that there would be demand for them because they could make them at a sufficiently low price. And so this meant an enormous change for Tesla. They were basically aiming to completely redesign, not just produce a new vehicle, but rethink the entire process for making vehicles. It's well known that robots are involved in the production of cars, and there's an assembly line, and as it rolls down the line, there's different robots involved putting things together. But if you look these days, even at very modern plants, there's always people almost at every station, that people are involved in putting things that sometimes are a little clumsy to fit together, that it takes a human touch to put it together right. And unfortunately, the decision to go for this alien Dreadnought, and the alien Dreadnought is this notion from science fiction that you can basically send a manufacturing plant as a probe into space, and it will constantly replicate itself. He was hoping to automate the production of cars so that it would start at one end and come off the other without any human intervention whatsoever. It was extremely ambitious. It was something that had never been done before for something the scale of a car. But the goal was to produce cars at low cost and super high volume. In the end, it turned into such a fiasco. It was very expensive, very demoralizing. It created cars that weren't very high quality, and really it just was slowing things down. And if the goal was to produce the Model 3 at volume, this was a failure. And in the end, Elon had to capitulate, and all his intentions about having people be removed from the process, he later admitted that people are pretty useful when it comes to building cars, and returned to a much more traditional assembly line. And so this is an example of Elon giving up on something. He was really determined to not just make a better car, but make a better factory. The machine that builds the machine was what he was going to focus on. And he wanted it to have the same degree of innovation and higher, not just an innovative, but better system than all the other car makers, but he had to backtrack. The second example that we could look at is the Falcon Heavy. So this is turning now to another, we've gone from Tesla, which is one of Elon's ventures, to SpaceX. So we talked a little bit about how the original rockets that SpaceX had, they blew up 3 times, then the 4th one got to orbit. Well, that was a single engine rocket. That's why it's called Falcon 1. Then they had the Falcon 9, which had 9 rockets on the, or 9 engines on the first stage. And this rocket was not only more powerful, but it was also capable of returning and landing propulsively. It was relatively, I mean, compared to some other commercial launch vehicles, it didn't have the ability to put large payloads, I mean, really large payloads into orbit. So they looked into creating something called the Falcon Heavy, which was basically a Falcon 9 with 2 additional Falcon 9 first stages on either side. And they succeeded. It took them a long time because they had a couple of incidents with the Falcon 9 where they really had to retrench and devote some engineering to figuring out what went wrong. But once they achieved that, they were able to create the Falcon Heavy, which again is this 3-core rocket. And their first flight was an enormous success. It took off. It put you may recall seeing images of him, the rocket put Elon Musk's red Tesla Roadster out into space. So it's drifting somewhere between here and Mars, apparently. And it did that because it had this super high, very powerful booster arrangement where it had 3 boosters instead of just 1. And also they managed to recover the 2 side boosters, and they only just missed landing the center core. So it was a very successful mission. And they've used it a couple of times since. But what's interesting is they haven't really used the Falcon Heavy very much. They've had, I think, 33 Falcon 9 launches, but I think only 1 Falcon Heavy this year. And so you have to ask, why is that? And why is it sort of being abandoned? Well, we do know that SpaceX is rushing to build the Starship, which is a single core, completely reusable. So a 2-stage rocket. The idea is that the booster, which I think has 27, is intended to have, it's not built yet, but I think it will have something like 27 rocket engines. And then a second stage, which will have, I think, 3 atmospheric engines, so small Bell engines, and 3 very large Bell vacuum engines. And its purpose in life is to put things into orbit and return safely to Earth. So now you have a completely reusable rocket. This is the intention. They're still working on it. They're still experimenting. But most importantly, this is going to be, I think it's a 9-meter diameter. It's an enormous rocket relative to the Starship Heavy, because the Starship Heavy, don't forget, it's really just 3 engines attached to the same payload bay. It's got a fairing at the top that is only so big. So it's sort of like putting 3 engines into your Honda Civic. You still only have 4 seats. Your trunk doesn't get any bigger. And so there was a limited practicality to what they could do with the Falcon Heavy. And they discovered that relatively early on. And even though they invested a ton of money and created something that is a very capable machine, they're basically abandoning it in favor of investing in something new. So this is an example of a sunk cost that they're walking away from, and even a successful one. But nevertheless, they're putting their eggs into the next basket, which is the Starship. Another example comes from the construction of the Starship itself. When they first started building prototypes of the Starship, they focused on using super lightweight materials, which makes intuitive sense. If you're going to put a rocket into orbit, and you can take a pound off the weight of the rocket, you can have an extra pound of payload, all things being equal. And so making a super lightweight fuselage for the Starship made perfect sense. The problem is that while they intended to use carbon fiber, and carbon fiber is super expensive. It's quite tricky to work with. But here's what's really interesting is it is super strong for the weight, but it turns to, it's like peanut brittle when it's cold, and it turns to, I don't know, like cotton candy when it's hot. And so it's not super strong for its weight under all circumstances that the vehicle will encounter. First of all, it's filled with cryogenic fuels or propellants. And then when it comes down from orbit, it is going to encounter superheat from friction as it falls through the atmosphere. So they changed their mind. They said, we can't use carbon fiber for that. We're going to use steel. It may be heavier, but it's super strong under all the circumstances we need it to be. And it's also easier to work with. And so this is another example of giving up on an investment that's already been made and moving on to the next thing. But it's because they have the end in mind. And we'll get to that in a minute. So when we talk about the alien Dreadnought, this factory that was supposed to be completely automated, Elon Musk backtracked and said, okay, we'll do it the old way. And I'm sure there's innovations in the plan. I don't want to knock the people involved, but it resembles a traditional car manufacturing plant far more than they originally intended. But they backtracked because they had a very clear goal. They were hoping that the alien Dreadnought design would contribute to the reduction of the cost of the Model 3, because that was don't forget, the objective of Tesla is to free us from using fossil fuels for transportation. And so to do that, you have to put people into electric vehicles. To do that, you have to make, for many people, affordable vehicles. And so they were really hoping they could lower the cost of production, which they could then share with the consumer by offering a lower price car. But it turns out that they were not, that was not turning out the way they wanted it to. It was actually going to make cars less plentiful and more expensive. So they backtracked. And so they kept, the goal was not to have an alien Dreadnought factory. The goal was to have a cheaper quality car. They had to change their approach to doing that. With the Falcon Heavy, they produced a vehicle that was extremely capable and extremely successful, but didn't have the commercial demand that they anticipated. And furthermore, they could see that with a spaceship, really volume matters. And when I say volume, like the larger the rocket, the more likely it is to make money, because a lot of the same complexity goes into a small rocket as a big rocket. So just make a big one already. And so the Super Heavy became sort of a middle child, and they I think will abandon it once they have the Starship up and running. It's easy to look at the Concord and say it was a complete failure because it cost so much, took so long, and wound up getting discontinued. It's hard to say whether something's a success or a failure without knowing the true motivation behind it. And I think in the case of the Concord, that's somewhat murky. Depending on where you look, people will say it was a joint venture between France and Britain that was intended to foster cordial relations between the two. The idea was that Britain wanted to basically cozy up to Europe. And so if that was the objective, then maybe it worked. Maybe it was worth the extra money. But when you don't have somebody at the helm who's extremely clear on what you want, it's really hard to make decisions about whether something is worth continuing or not. Was it worth the investment of 1.3 billion pounds? I think that a clear-headed financial analysis would say absolutely not. It never covered its costs. The French and British governments poured money into that program and never saw it again. But again, it comes down to the question of what is the purpose? I believe that the reason Elon Musk is so clear on when to continue to invest in something or when not to is because he has super clear objectives for his companies. In the case of Tesla, the objective is to free the world from reliance on fossil fuels. In the case of SpaceX, it's to make the human race interplanetary. Basically, the definition of that goal is to create a colony on Mars.
In fact, he measures pretty much every major decision by whether or not it brings the day when we have a self-sustainable colony on Mars sooner or later. That's the prism by which he makes every single decision he makes it through that prism.
Every single decision that Elon Musk makes within the company is about contributing to that goal. So if the question was, would Elon Musk have continued to double down on the Concord? It really hinges on, well, what is the objective of Concord? And to me, that's kind of murky. If the objective was to get people from New York to London and back as quickly as possible, then he might have said, okay, well, the Concord is not a commercially viable option for that early on in the design, and said, what can we do differently? You know, who knows? Maybe he would have come to the conclusion, I mean, we're talking a long time ago, but he might have come to the conclusion that these suborbital flights of rockets would be a better way to go about it. We don't know. But the thing is, without knowing the true objective, we don't know what they should have been willing to give up on and how much they would have been able to pivot. But because Elon Musk has such clarity on what he's trying to achieve, this is why I think that he doesn't worry himself about sunk cost. If something turns out to be not the correct course of action, he will not double down to save face. He will just change his mind and go do something else. That was then, this is now. What's the best decision now? So this has to be pretty exhausting, you would think, for the people who work at Tesla and at SpaceX. You know, 1 minute it's carbon fiber, then we're not doing carbon fiber. You spend maybe 5 or 6 years of your life developing the Falcon Heavy, and then actually we're not going to use it that much. We're moving to the Starship. Or everybody get to work designing the alien Dreadnought. Okay, on second thoughts, we're just going to use a conventional assembly line. I know that, you know, I am a manager. I have people who report to me, and I do not relish telling them, remember that thing I said was important? Well, we're not doing it anymore, so just drop it. Like, that's people's time and investment. That's the morale that can be affected by such a thing. But Elon doesn't care. Elon takes the view that everybody should be contributing to the mission of the entire organization. That's why he's so emphatic about what the mission is.
You know, what I actually used to tell a team is, like, everyone is a chief engineer. This is extremely important. And that everyone must understand how broadly speaking, all the systems in the vehicle work.
If you work for a place where it turns out that what you're doing is no longer contributing to the entire organization's goal, okay, then you just pivot and start doing something else. Your morale shouldn't be affected because it's not a competition. You're there to contribute to the goal. You know, it's not like it's a secret. If you're working for Elon at SpaceX, the goal is to make life interplanetary. If there's a better way to do it, and it means changing what you do, then you need to do it. If today Elon emerged from a coma or from a long prison sentence, he wouldn't be wringing his hands about the time that was wasted. Today is day one. We can take this attitude as well, and we can take this attitude to rethink our response to sunk costs. If we made a decision and it turns out that wasn't the right decision, that was then, this is now. What's the right decision today? This doesn't just apply to billion-dollar decisions for large organizations. It can apply to a small unit within a large organization, and it can apply to your own business, your startup, and to your personal life and the way you run your personal finances. And in fact, It would be, I think this may be the first comparison between Elon Musk and Marie Kondo, but this idea that if something doesn't bring you joy, then you get rid of it. And there is a parallel there, this idea that we invest in things. Oh, well, I bought all these books. I spent all this money. I made a collection out of it. And now I have all the books in the series and they're just collecting dust and now I need to move. Do I need this burden with me for the rest of my life, or can I abandon it? And so I think that there's a connection there too, that like if Elon Musk gets to the point where he's opened up new gigafactories that are far closer to the alien Dreadnought design that he was hoping for, if he gets that to work in new facilities where he has a clean sheet of paper, then he may get to the point where it's simply no longer worthwhile running the Fremont factory, that it is a sunk cost. He's clearly invested in there a lot, but it gets to the point where it doesn't make cars as well as his other facilities. He may simply walk away from it, and that's fine. It no longer brings joy. It no longer brings profit. But here's another quote that I'd like to share with you from Marie Kondo, which says, "Never discard anything without saying thank you and goodbye." And I think that's interesting as well, that there's a relationship between what she's saying about our personal belongings and what we as leaders, how we respond to having to abandon things that we've tried in our organizations. It's not simply a matter of saying, drop it like a hot rock. It's about saying, okay, what can we learn from that experience? We tried with carbon fiber, and we have discovered that there's a different way, but thank goodness we tried this way. It gave us some experience and we know what we're doing better, and we may turn around using carbon fiber later on. So you don't have to walk away from that as a waste or feeling shame, but rather as a worthwhile experiment. And in fact, we can do that prospectively too. Instead of embarking on something saying, the only reason to do this is because we're 100% certain, you can take the attitude that this is the best approach we are aware of. We're going to try it. And if it doesn't turn out, we will give it a thank you. What is it? We will say thank you to it and goodbye. So take the time to reflect on the ingenuity, the intention, the effort that went into that course of action, celebrate it, and then move on to the next thing. That was then, this is now. What's the best course of action now? That's what Elon would do, and that's what we can do.